Welcome back again, everybody. So we've been doing some of these how do characters evolve or how do creatures evolve from early editions of Dungeons and Dragons to recent editions. And we found out owlbears lost their ability to hug, which is sad because everybody needs a hug. Mimics haven't really changed a lot, except they change all the time, sort of pun intended there. And today we're diving into goblins. And Bill Silvey is back, our first edition D&D expert. And Richard Whitters is back, who of course draws the best goblins in the business. Uh,
Woo!
Even though he said it's a heat wave in Canada today, which means all of what is it, like 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 40?
Yeah, I had to take off my sweater. Eh?
It's, it's terrible. But the deeper I dug into goblins, I kind of I went down the rabbit hole and I said, okay, let's go look at a whole bunch of them. And then I said, okay, were they originally a D&D thing? Because like owlbears just popped up out of nowhere because Gary Gygax had a bunch of toys from a five and dime that, hey, that kind of looks like a bear and an owl. Hey, we're making an owl bear. Mimics are just, then you had, we're just sort of a creation. Beholders sort of came out of a nightmare of somebody that worked at the company. But goblins have been around a long time. So I kind of went deeper and I said, okay, where really did they get their start? And it was not recent. These guys have been around kind of forever. So here's your standard everyday goblin. And before somebody else, this is not AI. I will admit that it is Adobe stock. Uh, Absolutely not my goblin. I have no artistic ability whatsoever, but he was cute, so I used it. But what are they? They kind of started from European folklore. They were kind of like brownies or gnomes or kobolds, and I misspelled kobold, but they were kind of like those guys. They're not big. They're not really dangerous one at a time. They don't always come one at a time, but they're not really dangerous. But they kind of first showed up in sort of around the 1100s in France, and in print, they showed up in the 14th century in this book called The Benevolent Goblin. It was a folk tale. Before that, it kind of got printed into this British Gesta Romanorum, which Benevolent Goblin, essentially. And there actually are modern translations of that available on Amazon. Richard, I'll have to send you one of those for Christmas just because you like goblins so much.
Woo! I'm into that.
um, because there's no way any of us are going to read Old English. That just doesn't, it's not even remotely close. So how far does it
Not even
go?
me.
Yeah, I know, right? Goblins have shown up in video games. They've had their own goblins. They've shown up in books. There's been book series about goblins. There's been movies about horror movies about goblins. I even found, and I just added this one. I want to see what you guys think of it. I found a movie in production right now, Goblins in Space Goblins. So,
Oh,
Goblins in Space.
Well, there you go.
It's actually, I put the synopsis there because I couldn't believe it. Having been living off the grid for the last decade, bounty hunters Gib and Gob find themselves called back into action for what could be their very last assignment. Now,
I'm too old for this shit, Gob.
too old for this shit, right? And it hit me. I was like, okay, that's weird. But it turns out that is a live action remake of an animation called Space Goblins. So these guys show up everywhere, right? They're not going away. They haven't really changed much over the years. Richard, thank you for this. They were in Labyrinth. I haven't seen Labyrinth since I was probably a teenager, so I'm going to let you guys talk about this one for a minute if you want. But I remember them. Richard, thank you for sending me that image.
Oh yeah, well this is it's Jim Henson, of course, like the Jim Henson puppets being used in live action, which was awesome at the time. I think they were all designed by Brian Froud, if I remember correctly, or at least he did a lot of the design.
Yes.
And Brian Froud and Alan Lee did the Book of Fairies. And if you like folklore,
that one right there,
like British Isles folklore, yeah, that book is Brian Froud and Alan Lee's Book of Fairies. Just buy it. It is amazing. It's just full of cool, little tidbits. But there's a lot in there on goblins. It says Book of Fairies, but there's a lot in there on goblins and hags and all that stuff. But yeah, I consider Brian Froud really, to me, defined the look for my generation anyway.
Cool. Then of course, I find this one interesting because the Harry Potter series had goblins, and goblins are notoriously cranky, angry creatures that nobody gets along with.
Mhm.
So J.K. Rowling made them bankers, which kind of worked for me, right? Because nobody likes, I mean, yeah, you get your mortgage and you're happy, but then when you get your mortgage statement, you're like, okay, that's not very nice, right?
Yeah.
So they made them bankers, which I thought was kind of creative. I had to give her credit for that one. Bill, this one's for you, man. I threw this in there, and I'll let
Right
you
on.
speak to the Tolkien version of goblins,
Well,
if you'd like.
my first blush with goblins was watching The Hobbit, the animated The Hobbit, in 1978. And of course, then I read the books. I just consumed the books as my hippie aunts gave me a copy of The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, and I absolutely devoured those and loved them. Um, and interestingly, uh, Tolkien's main adversaries in the Lord of the Rings, the cannon fodder for both Saruman and Sauron, were orcs, and Tolkien used orc and goblin interchangeably. So you can say that when you're reading The Hobbit, the creatures that you're seeing in The Hobbit are the same as the creatures that, say, Merry and Pippin are carted off from after the battle at the division, the breaking of the Fellowship. Um, so that was my first blush with goblins, and then of course, uh a few years later when I got into Dungeons and Dragons, I was delighted to see those little uh green and orange skinned suckers show up as XP on the foot.
Mhm.
XP on
And
the
the
foot.
Hobbit was Rankin Bass, I think.
Yes, that is correct. Little bit of trivia for our watchers. Those of you who are fans of the output of Studio Ghibli, and of course you should be, they make very beautiful cartoons. Studio
Mhm.
Ghibli at that time was a Japanese animation company called Topcraft, and they're responsible for the animation of both The Hobbit and The Return of the King that Rankin Bass did. They commissioned them to do the animation. So
Yep.
there's your trivia for the day.
They
So
pulled off a lot of things that were still like animated, they were kind of cute, but
Mhm.
they also could be very creepy. And I really loved it as a kid. Like,
Yeah.
so Richard, your artwork is unique in that you're sort of like the goblin specialist. Um,
yeah.
so where do you pull when you're thinking, hey, I'm going to come up with a new goblin with drool and whatever else, do you have one of those areas you think of more than others, or is it just sort of like a generic, I pull from everywhere and stick it in one spot kind of thing?
Um, Kind of depends on what you're. It's funny. I had a conversation about that at the time on D&D because I was like, we in fifth edition they had a very set design for the goblins. Like they had this sort of yellowy orangey look and a certain hook to the noses and big scraggly ears and stuff. And there was a certain point I had talked to them.
Which
I was like, yeah,
is
maybe
that look
uh
right there.
yeah, it should be Steve Prescott. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so Steve Prescott designed those and they're awesome. But I always wanted, and I was like, well, we can't do it now because we've sort of committed at that point. We were already committed. But I was like, I really like the idea of goblins going more towards that Brian Froud thing where they were just a crazy mixture of different things, right? Um, and then if you look through the D&D history stuff, to me that was an opportunity where you could throw in all these goblins and you could kind of say like, yeah, that second edition goblin Tony DiDerlizzi did, that's right. And the first edition goblin, that's also right. I can just like put them all together. And I thought, well, then there's an
Like
opportunity to
that one
throw
right
Easter
there.
eggs. Yeah.
David A.
Yeah.
Champier.
Yeah. Trampier is amazing.
Yeah.
I've redrawn homages to that goblin several times. But yeah, anyway, the drawing to me, it always just depended on what kind of goblins do you want. Like, do you want swamp goblins? Do you want subterranean goblins? And then I usually start with sort of environment or what's their job, that kind of thing.
Oh, so you build the goblin around what he does for a living instead of vice. That's actually kind of an interesting take. I would have never thought of that about that. But that's why I'm not the artist and you are.
Hmm.
That's
It was a concept push thing we used to talk about all the time, like jobbiness. Like, it's like the job is the connection between the creature or whatever character and the world.
Hmm.
And job's like a broad term. So it's basically, what are you doing here? Like
Mhm.
like what's your thing? You collect eggs? Do you swing a sword? Like
Yeah, because you don't want like this little guy behind me swinging a giant sword, right? It just doesn't work. The
mm-hmm.
momentum of the sword would carry him across the battlefield and he'd be done.
Yeah,
But a Jon Snow sized goblin, on the other hand, can wield a decent sword and not have any issues with it.
exactly.
So when you guys have created more adventures than I have, I play more. You guys GM more or DM more, whatever way you want to call it. Um, Goblins individually as a player aren't a big deal, right? They're kind of easy to take down, but when you guys are designing them, these bastard game masters never bring one goblin at a time.
No,
It's
no,
just never like, here's a goblin, he's attacking you. You're like, oh, how cute. Stab him with a paper clip, right? And problem solved.
right.
It,
In making a game, there was two design issues I had to, if you want to talk that a little bit.
Mhm.
But there's two design issues I ran in with, like, goblins and little guys. And one of them was, obviously you get a bunch of little guys, but they all get an attack, right? So if I have 10 goblins and 5 characters, they get 10 attacks. So that's 10 opportunities to hit, and that increases their chances to do damage. So they can be very deadly that way. But because they have low hit points, you also have a damage runoff, I used to call it.
Mhm.
So if a thing has 2 hit points and you do 10 damage, that could have killed 5 goblins. That could have done 10 damage to an ogre. But it really does 2 damage to a goblin, and you waste 8 points of damage on the goblin. So when you put them in a game, you got to be kind of careful because they hit above their weight class a lot of times.
Mm.
Mm. Especially if you send them in as a pack.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
one kobold, no big deal. 15 kobolds, on the other hand, and you're going to have your ankles eaten for lunch.
Yep.
It's a whole different world. Bill, how
So,
about you? You always come up with some creative stuff as a game creator.
you know, there's a very infamous story that gets passed around gaming tables. It's almost as old as Dungeons and Dragons itself. It's a story of Tucker's kobolds, and we can talk about kobolds another time. But the kobolds and goblins are roughly equivalent in terms of their combat ability. In fact, the first place that goblins and kobolds are mentioned is in Chainmail, the war game that preceded Dungeons and Dragons and inspired the creation of fantasy role-playing games. And we see here, goblins and kobolds are the natural and most hated enemies of dwarves and gnomes, and they'll attack each other before any other enemies in sight. It says here, this is in Chainmail on page 27, I think, if you're playing along at home. Um, and then there's the specific mention of them. Again, first time, as far as I'm aware, in any tabletop game here in Chainmail. Goblins and kobolds will see well in dimness or dark, but they do not like bright light. Because of their reciprocal hatred, goblins and kobolds will automatically attack any dwarves or gnomes within charging distance, and then it goes on to explain their point value and how they fight and so on. But the thing with the goblins or kobolds or whatever is using them in waves and making them aware of their surrounding. You don't, as you say, you don't send one goblin in And you certainly don't charge him right up toe to toe with the human and plate mail, who's effectively storm giant size compared to the goblin. No, you have them hide behind rocks in rooms where they've had their tribal shaman cast a magical darkness so no one can see except them. And then they pepper with arrows and slingstones and fall back. And, they throw flaming oil, and they hide inside barrels and garrot the magic user who thinks he's safe in the rear of the party. And they weave nets that they haul up to the ceiling filled with rocks and wait for the party to run in and drop them, that sort of thing. uh goblins the goblins utilized in the right fashion can be the death of high level parties. And that's what makes them so fiendish. I mean, you say, yeah, my character fell to a huge ancient red dragon. My character fell saving the party from a demon or a devil. My character fell, when we entered the lair of the bee here or a purple worm or something like that. Yeah, my 10th level fighter got dragged to the floor by 25 goblins. They pried open his plate mail and stabbed him to death. That's pretty ignominious. And that's why, as a dungeon master, I like to use such things on high level parties. That
If nobody could tell, Bill subscribes to the adversarial dungeon master theory.
Look, I never make things too hard. I make things exactly hard enough.
He's not a player's friend. He doesn't mind killing one. It's okay. It's
no, I've never killed a player. I've killed plenty of characters, but I've never killed a player. But you bring the weight of low ability monsters. You make up for it by using hit and run tactics, or if you have to confront the party, if you backed them into the goblin's throne room, you have to bring waves. And that brings me to a funny story. So one of the things that I worked on with Gary Gygax was a module called Teeth of the Barkeshnor, and he gave me a lot of latitude in creating the encounters. He gave me a very loose outline of where things were. I got to put a dungeon section in it that it actually eventually did get published by Frog God Games. It's called The Lost Crypt. But in Gary's notes, there's a cave off in the hills, and it's the Hall of the Great Goblin King. There's 400 goblins here and their king, and that's it. That's literally all it says. So I asked Gary, I said, oh, so Gary, can I take this maybe and make it like a ruined castle or an abandoned mine, and have you take the 400 goblins and have encounter rooms in there? And he came back and said, nope, it's one hall, 400 goblins. Don't change it. And I was like, okay.
That's when you have to be okay with Fireball.
I just figure it's like the goblins loyal order of the water buffalo meeting. It's like they're having their yearly banquet, and the party just stumbles into it right then.
And the party could be tasty. I mean, to a goblin, the party could just be, hey, we're kind of running low on food. Meat, come on, let's go.
Yeah. And
Goblin
let me
Gen Con.
As a guy, it's Goblin Gen Con. As a guy who has rolled lots of dice, I can tell you, I don't care if you're armor class -2 and you have protection from evil and bless and prayer, and your character's carrying a luck stone. I will roll enough 20s to make you start sweating. If you give me 400 goblins, I will. The weight of numbers are not on your side.
Just statistically speaking, there's going to be a few that
statistically speaking, yeah, your characters are going to get borne down. And I mean, you have to consider things like morale. It's like, well, we just killed 175 goblins and didn't take any damage. Okay, I as the game master have to go, how much do these guys really want y'all dead, and how much do they want to just run away until you leave and go find something else? So there's that. But yeah, no, the proper utilization of goblins is either in ambush or in sheer weight of numbers. You don't you don't send 5 goblins against 5 player characters. That's like sending, you know, 5 M113s against 5T90s. It's not the same.
Well,
It's
and
not the
here,
same.
I mean, here's kind of why, right? This is the red book stat block on
Yes.
the left. Yeah, you kind of get 2 to 8, and if you 2 to 8 of them appearing at once, and
Mhm.
they're not tough to kill, right?
No,
They're pretty
no, they
easy.
have 1 to 7 hit points. Um, and
Mhm.
and typically they're not rocking a lot of armor or weapons.
Yeah, and even if you look at fifth edition, which is the other stat blocks here, the goblin itself, it didn't change a lot, right? He kind of didn't really make a lot of adjustments. I think it was maybe a little bit better hit damage, but it's not a ton.
Yeah.
They did add a goblin boss, which kind of makes sense to me, but they kind of extended the goblin world to have this boss character.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And Richard, you were there when this took place. Did the goblin boss, was that like kicked around, or was it like that was always in there? We're just going to kind of make it, official now.
There was a lot of that stuff. Like I wasn't right there when they were doing that particular thing, but I know a lot of things just came from, you know, like other sources, because
Yeah.
it's basically you have all those years of sources.
Yeah. And
Um,
when you've got I'm sorry, Richard, go ahead. I stepped on you.
yeah. Oh no, no, that's okay. Yeah, I was just gonna say like, uh, Rodney Thompson and Peter Lee, I think, did a lot of the mechanical design for that stuff, and they were both really big into looking, back into the historical stuff, and James Wyatt as well, very, very into that stuff. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they dug stuff out of old editions, Dragon magazine, and any good ideas to try to pull them in.
Yeah. And even here in the monster manual, showing that listing, we get for every 40 encounter, there'll be a leader and 4 assistants who are equal to orcs. And then if you get 200 or more, you get a sub chief, 2 to 8 guards fighting as hobgoblins, and 25% chance any force of goblins is going to be mounted on wolves, which again, that comes straight from Tolkien. You had the wargs that the goblins would come out in the Hobbit.
Yep.
And then
And then
bugbears.
yeah, you can end up with, if you read on here, a goblin chief and 2 to 8 bodyguards with 9 to 14 hit points, and they fight as gnolls doing 2 to 8 points of damage. And even the lair will have 5 to 30 huge wolves, and they might have the companionship of bugbears. So, and that's not even to go into stuff like options given in the Dungeon Master's Guide for tribal spellcasters. I mean, imagine your fifth, sixth level party is happily hacking their way through a goblin's lair, laughing about how much or how little XP they're going to get when all this is done, and suddenly their protective spells start going away because that one in the funny hat standing in the back is yelling "ooga booga" and waving his hands. Now you've got a real problem.
Yeah, I had a long running little goblin bandit NPC group.
Mhm.
It was led by Nurgle the Sly. And that name
Love it.
Nurgle, like Nurgle, I think is from the old Warhammer role playing or something. Like I think is
Yeah.
chaos god.
Uh-huh. The
Um,
plague bearer or something.
yes, exactly. So I like the name Nurgle. So I was like, oh, he's Nurgle the Sly. And he had like this rotating cast of little goblins who'd be around him because they would die a lot. But it was always, I'd pop him up on the characters every once in a while, and he always had some elaborate like trap set up for them. Um, and one time in the world, I had this big roadway going right across the world that was sort of like a Roman highway. So along that highway, there were like these rest stop sort of places. So the party stopped at this rest stop, and they're like, "That's really weird. There's this big bent tree at the edge of the rest stop," and they're like fiddling around. And Nurgle and his crew had set up a catapult right under the campfire part of this rest stop. And about half the party got catapulted into these trees. And then they're like, attack. So he was always popping up and things like that, which is very like koboldy kind of, but but he was, and it was always like a fun aside where it's like, because they would have these adventures where it's like, we got to do this and we got to save this and that, or the town will fall. And then every once in a while, they just get catapulted into a tree and be like, oh God, it's Nurgle.
So I'm just going to throw this out there, Richard.
Mhm.
A goblin crossed with a tinker gnome.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
What could go wrong? Nothing. It perfect. Everything's fine. It's
That,
just
that's just an interpretation of a physicist, but
yeah, that's true.
that's fantasy physicist.
The tinker gnomes, I being a physicist, the tinker gnomes are always fascinating to me. The only trouble I had was when they showed up like in Dragonlance books. I get to the top of the chapter and there'd be like that sketch that they would always include of whatever the tinker gnomes are working on. And I'd
Yep.
spend 20 minutes looking at the sketch, trying to figure out if
Yeah.
the sketch was accurate. And it always was pretty good. So it was like, it's
Well,
actually a lot of benefit to that sketch. But I actually had one where I was actually reading one of the Dragonlance books where there was one of the Tinker Gnomes whose life mission was to like study the dragon orbs, and one got shattered in front of him and he just about fell over dead.
Oh.
And then he wound up sketching out every little piece of the dragon orb. It was really sad. We're not talking about those today. But goblins, that's an interesting thread. So I'd like to hear from each of you guys. What have you ever done to give a goblin a unique personality? I like the hurling your enemies into the trees. That's pretty funny. And Bill's over there taking notes, going, hurl
Yeah,
Tim's
hurl
character
Tim's
into
into
trees.
trees. Generally speaking, like I said, I go back to tribal spell casting. That's always a shock.
Mm.
As old as AD&D is, and as many times as I've had people tell me, "Oh yeah, no, I've read the Dungeon Master's Guide and so on and etc. I'm happy to play it, yada yada yada." Um, they never see that coming. They never see the goblins. There's 150 goblins in these caves. You didn't think they had a church?
Mhm.
You didn't think they were getting down on their knees and praying to Maglubiet on on Goblins Day
Mhm.
for strength and power.
So
And
I just want to point out to everybody that Bill does not study for these things. He just happens to know the name of the goblin god off the top of his head. There was no prep work that went into this.
um now if you want to talk about kobolds, their god is Kurtlumak.
There
But
you go.
I'm getting or Lagazed, of course, is the disgusting god of the troglodytes, but we're getting far afield here.
No
Um,
studying. See?
no study. But no, I like I basically just, it's like if someone breaches your neighborhood,
Mm.
right? Someone with bad intent comes in your neighborhood. You know all the back alleys. You know the streets, who has a privacy fence up and whose yard you can just run through, so on and etc. And if push came to shove, you'd use all of those terrain advantages. You know whose door you could knock on and that sort of thing. Uh, and goblins are the same way. They're not going to sit in their room warming themselves around a coal brazier waiting for you to come in and behead them all. It's
Mhm.
it's simply not something that even low intellect creatures like goblins are going to do, is just sit around waiting to get murdered by like cows. Um, the best personality you
And,
can give goblins is just make them think tactically.
and they're
You
not
Yep.
that low intelligence. I'm looking at the fifth edition book, and it's intelligence 10. I mean, it's not.
Yeah, they're clever.
Yeah, I
They're,
mean,
they're,
you've gotta you've got to give them some uh give them their due. Make
Mhm.
players respect the dungeon environment when they're in there. Don't let them just walk in and kick them around. Um,
they're little, but they're scrappy.
they're little, but they're scrappy. Absolutely. And guys out there, if you're watching this, look, I promise if you play 5e or 3 or whatever, owning an AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide won't burn your hands, or even a monster manual. Look at how beefy they can get on the command end. 9 to 14 hit points, fight as gnolls, and then you throw in tribal spellcasters, and suddenly, haha, my 6th level fighter will wade in because I get, because goblins are technically under 1 hit dice, and AD&D has sweep rules for creatures that have less than 8 hit points, where you can make a number of attacks equal to your level on them. So
Yeah.
uh, your 8th level, your fighter is facing 8 goblins. Odds are 8 goblins are probably going to die. Um, you know, DMs don't make it just a like, oh, I got to go out, I got to go out and run the weed whacker over some goblins. And by doing this, you make the players earn the experience points. It wasn't just a waste of an evening. You're making better players. That's what I like to do with goblins and kobolds.
And if you look at their stat block, let me pull it back up here so you can see it. At least 5e. Let's worry about that for a second. They're pretty dexterous, right? They're not going to be shockingly easy to charm. You unless you just nuke them with a fireball or lightning bolt or something. They're not total wimps. They're kind of little scrappy things. They're kind of tough.
Yeah.
There's one I used to use here and there. It was kind of fun. I think you kind of imagine it. And it was sort of like what I used to call like the ring of murder. but you have some big main creature, like let's say it's a big ogre or something, and the party's like dealing with the ogre. But somewhere in a little bit higher ground, could be in the trees or could be up in a ring of cliffs or something like that. There's some goblins up there with like bows or crossbows or something. And you make and like you're saying, Bill, you make the goblins intelligent. So what they're trying to do is put the last bolt into the character that's almost down. They're trying to take out characters that are flailing. They're trying to disrupt spellcasters. They're trying to do that stuff. And before you know it, you have them like, well, we got to fight this ogre. And then it'll go a round or two and it'll be like, somebody do something about those goddamn goblins.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I always found that kind of fun. Give them a little edge.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And
Hey, Maleficent and Sleeping Beauty. She had a goblin army backing her up.
I'm telling you, that would run havoc on any spellcasters in the party because you have to be able to concentrate. And if you got 30 annoying things throwing pebbles at you, they might not be big pebbles, but they're not little ones either, right? Because you guys aren't their strength is not terrible. It could disrupt the spellcaster pretty handily. So yeah, and if you got a 10th, 11th party, level party, maybe it's not a fair fight. But if you're first, second, third, fourth, fifth, it could be a TPK with these guys.
Well, I think that would go to like when you're saying like Bill, and I know the chat about the adversarial DM and stuff like that. But basically, if the DM is not using some strategy, and like it's fun to begin with, but if the DM is not using some strategy, then the players won't change strategies. And you'll just get like, I hit, I miss, they hit, they miss, I hit, they miss. So you want to throw them curveballs and not be predictable. And I think that's a huge thing that, otherwise your combat and encounters and things can get really just sort of like bland because you're really just playing roll 20, roll damage or not, how many hit points do they have? And it's like you don't want to do that. You want to add an element of like, oh, there's something's going on up there. We got to do this. Our spellcaster's getting screwed up. Well,
that's actually one of the things now after talking to you guys and looking at these more carefully, as a DM with my kids, I can see using goblins that actually have, will taunt the players. Maybe not to the level Bill, maybe not to the level of Kender does. But a goblin that loves to just shout things like, "Yeah, your mother was an orc," whatever. It could be fun to have some like that because I think they've been overlooked. I think they get used as like cannon fodder in a lot of games, as in a lot of dungeons, and I think they deserve a little more than that. I think they deserve to actually kind of be the star of the show once in a while.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But that's just me. All right, so I think that's at this a while. You guys want to add anything, or do you want to call this one a wrap and say goblins haven't really evolved much? Maybe just added some leaders over the years, because I think first through fifth edition, even back to chainmail, they kind of seem pretty consistent to me.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
I think they're, you know, they, as Richard said, they can punch above their weight. They really can punch above their weight. And if you're, as a player, if you're not careful and you don't respect what they can and will do to your party, that shiny fifth level character that you've had oodles of fun may just be parted out for the magic items and treasure you had by the rest of the party because you didn't respect the goblin.
Yep. I think there's an interesting part to them too, that they kind of straddle that line where it's like, I think most of the time they're going to be like attacking you and doing this and that, but to me they've always had that sort of like, they're cunning and they're schemers a little bit, and they're kind of tricksters. But there's also that angle too where it's like a goblin you might be able to make a deal with. And I never felt like kobolds might be tricky to make a deal with, but a
Mhm.
goblin, you offer him enough coin, he might be like, yeah.
That strikes on something that I think a lot of players miss, and especially kind of newer players, or players, or I don't know, some players miss the fact that RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons are role playing games, and sometimes your adversary can become your friend if you role play it correctly. You don't have to hack and slash everything, right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
if you're massively outnumbered, sometimes trying to buy the enemy off can be a viable answer to the problem, right? It's like,
And there's the shadowy part in between where
yeah.
it's like, I think we can trust this guy. Like, and you're like, well, all we got to do is
Yep.
get through this, and he said he can show us where the door is. So it's like, okay, hopefully we can
Hey,
trust him.
it's printed in black and white in the 1E player's handbook. Avoid unnecessary encounters. Parlay is a thing. If you can throw a bag of rations and maybe those copper pieces that you found that you don't want when you beat up a bunch of kobolds, to get the goblins to, here, just play with this.
Yeah.
Why
Yep.
not?
I'll give you a new axe if you'll help me with,
Yeah.
XYZ, whatever it
Yeah.
is. But I think
I
a
did
lot of
that in
players miss that. So
I did that in a game once when I was playing. I was just like, because I had a character with pretty good charisma and stuff, and but I think he was just like a fighter. And we came across these goblins, and everybody draws swords. And I'm like, foul things. And then I was like, hey, you're kind of handsome for a goblin. And the DM was like, you think
Yikes.
so? Well, yeah, like, well, not in a weird way, but you're a good looking goblin. You know what I mean?
So handsome from a goblin, from the guy who draws the best goblins in the business.
We're
He's not partial or anything at all. It's
skating dangerously
yeah.
close to the short stack goblin meme, but don't Google that, kids.
Oh no, nope.
I'm gonna Google that as soon as we're not recording anymore.
Screen cap it because I'm not.
I might put that in a private browser window and maybe put Norton up on top of it just to make
There you
sure.
go.
That
Maybe
not,
open up a VM, like spin up a VM, and
get out my Raspberry Pi and say, okay, if something's going to go down, let's make sure
there
it's
you
the
go.
cheap one, right?
Gonna wind up on a list.
Dude, if there's a list out there, I am already on it.
I think it's your station in life, Tim. You're compiling the list, so
not anymore. I gave that job up, but it was kind of funny for a while that I pick on artists because I love artists, and I never met an artist I actually didn't get along with, except for one whose art I didn't really like that much, and they got very offended that it just wasn't for me, but it was very abstract modern art, and I'm like, I don't get it. I wasn't rude about it. I'm just, it's not my style. And they're like, oh, you just don't understand, and it's only $5,000. You should buy. I'm like, I don't like it. I'm not gonna spend $5,000 on it. Apparently I was rude. But artists I usually get along with, it's the pesky scientists oh wait, I am one of those. It's the engineers that we always have the issues with. And I actually I was working on a project for a while that I was trying to go on vacation, and they gave me a list of countries I wasn't allowed to go visit for a while. So I was like, okay, that's weird. Why can't I go there? Well, it's what you're working on. I'm like, okay, good to know that I might be kidnapped because of my job. Thank you very much.
By goblins.
Yeah.
Fight
Don't go to
goblins.
Goblonia, I guess is what they were telling you. That Tim, you
Well,
can't go to Goblonia because the next thing you know, the goblins have high energy lasers, and then
I'm not afraid of high energy lasers at all. I'm much more afraid of fast moving projectiles. So uh, anyway, all right, I think we'll just leave it there, and I'm gonna come up with another creature to go off and talk about, and once I
kobolds,
figure that
do
out,
kobolds.
kobolds. Okay, we'll do kobolds, but Bill, you got to find get uh I got to think of somebody else we got to bring into that one
Okay.
who'd be fun. I'm thinking.
uh,
Go
you
ahead, Bill.
could poke Tony Dierlitzy.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's get Tony on.
Yeah, see if he'll poke him. See if he'll come on.
All right, we'll do that. Like kobolds will be next because I think a lot of these overlooked little creatures are where a lot of the fun of the game happens. So I'm
Hmm.
going to start digging into these. And by the way, I did throw, and I'll leave everybody with this one. I threw it to Grok, which is the AI system that's running around on Twitter.
Hmm.
Um, what is the least popular creature in Dungeons and Dragons? Okay. Did either of you
Okay.
guys see that post?
I
Yes.
don't. I'm not logged into Twitter on my studio
All
PC. So
right. So let me see if I can find it. There it is. The least popular creature. Bill, take a wild guess at what it would be.
least popular. Man, I see. I'm biased because there's stuff that I just hate. Um. Oh gosh, Le
Wolpertinger was the answer.
Wolpertinger.
Wolperting. I have never. Wow, that's yeah.
I had never even heard of it. It turns out it's like a bunny rabbit with deer antlers. So,
Oh, yeah,
I
yeah,
thought I thought that was called a jackalope.
yeah.
well, apparently there is one in, let me show you here. There is one in fifth edition someplace, and it looks a lot like that right there. It's also got weird wings on it and
Yep.
funny teeth.
Huh.
I'd never even heard of it, but I'm going to
Eh.
guess it falls in that same category of things where one of them is not bad. 50 of them could be bad,
The
unless you're Monty Python and then it takes one.
the
There's
weirdest
a
one for me
wolves.
was the weirdest one for me was the intellect devourer. Or no, not the intellect devourer. What is it? You know, Bill, the one that looks like sort of a skeletal platypus.
That is the thought eater.
Thought eater.
The thought
Thought eater.
eater, it hangs out in
Yeah.
the ethereal plane, and if you start casting a bunch of mentally oriented spells or you are psionic, it will swim over to you. But remember, it's in the ethereal plane. It can't be seen unless somebody in
Yep.
your party goes ethereal, and it basically just hovers above you, slowly draining your intelligence.
Yeah. I never found a spot for that, and well, it's because of the ethereal thing. Because you don't have a lot of. I didn't have a lot of games were ethereal, but
So
also it's very odd.
what was the one that came up with the Dungeons and Dragons movie that only attach intelligent people and like they like walk past the party?
That might have been the intellect devourers. Were they just little brains on feet?
Little brains on feet. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep, that's the intellect devourer.
Yeah. So
The
it
intellect devourer.
yeah.
The original intellect devourers were pretty damn nightmarish because
Mhm.
they. I mean, we could be here another hour talking about
Well,
weird esoteric monsters.
in the movie, for anybody who hasn't seen it, the intellect devourers come upon the party, and uh, one of the characters, the wise one, looks at him and goes, "Be careful; these only attack those they find intelligent." And the intellect devourers come up, kind of look at the bard, look at the party, and just walk off. And the bard's like, "Well, that was kind of insulting." I don't. It's like, but what are you going to do, right? The intellect devourer decides not to attack you. Are you happy about it, or are you sad about that? I don't know. Which way could go either way. But that could be an interesting one. The other one I'm going to dig into, Bill, and you'll appreciate this, is I don't want to do it one character at a time. I want to dig into characters that can suck levels. Like so
Yeah, level
so
draining undead, baby.
level draining undead, I think is one of those things that if
Mhm.
you've never seen it happen, you might be, as a player, if you've never come across it, you're like, hey, I'm 5th level, I'm going in. All right, the evil guy just hit you and drained 2
Yeah,
levels of your experience. You're now a 3rd level fighter. Start subtract. It's like you're like,
yeah.
wait, what? That just hurt like a lot.
Hit points gone, fighting ability gone, spell casting ability gone.
Those are evil creatures, and I want to know who first put them in the damn book because I might have to have a little discussion with them, and if they're dead, wait till I die and then go have a discussion with them. But kobolds could be next. So, all right, everybody, have a great day. Stay tuned to the channel. You know, Bill, I'll link to your stuff. Richard, I'll link to your Twitter account
Sweet.
in the description. So everybody have a great one, and we'll do another one of these at some point. Don't know when, but we'll figure out when. Everybody have a great day.